right, good morning, everybody. I'm making breakfast for my daughters. I figured I'd make a quick video about tariffs because it's all anybody's talking about right now for obvious reasons. And this one's bothersome because this has never been a controversial topic in economics. In fact, in 1930, that was the last time this was really controversial, and that was when Herbert Hoover implemented the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which is widely recognized as having exacerbated the Great Depression. And in 1930, 1,028 economists wrote a famous letter appealing to Hoover to veto the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. He didn't do it, and the Great Depression, as we all know, ended up being a humongous disaster. And since then, tariffs have really never been implemented in the United States. And in fact, it's one of the only issues in economics that virtually every economist agrees about across the board. According to a 2021 poll from the American Economics Association, 95% of economists reject the use of tariffs and claim that it reduces living standards. And so this is something that, regardless of your political stripes, virtually all economists agree about this. And so whether you're Milton Friedman or Paul Krugman, this is one of the most widely agreed upon subjects. And so why did this suddenly become so controversial in the last few years? I want to cover a bunch of different myths and different talking points that I think people are misunderstanding about this, and I hope this provides some clarity about why tariffs are bad and why this really is something that shouldn't be controversial. So to begin with, let's talk about just how tariffs work at a basic operational level. So if we import $100 of goods from China and the US government imposes a 20% tariff on Chinese imports, what happens there is that the domestic firm that takes receipt of that $100 of goods will have to pay a $20 fee to the US government at customs. And so what this ultimately ends up being is it's functionally a corporate tax. And so the tricky thing here is that corporations don't really pay taxes in any meaningful sense. So the people that really pay corporate taxes are either consumers, shareholders, or the working class laborers. And what that basically means is that corporations always try to pass on their cost to somebody else. And so when they incur that $20 fee, what the firm that imports that fee is going to try to do is then pass it on to you and I. And that's why people often say that tariffs will create inflation, or tariffs are a tax that ultimately results in higher prices. And so from a basic functional level, we should be clear that China is not paying this fee. China might be negatively impacted in other ways, but from a basic operational perspective, all else equal, China's not the one paying this. The domestic firms are paying it, and ultimately they're going to try to pass it on, and that's either going to be reflected in lower share prices, which is what we're seeing with the stock market right now, or we're going to see some combination of consumers having to pay higher prices, workers getting fewer jobs, lower wages, or ultimately, potentially, the firms eating it through lower share prices. So one of the really common narratives around this is this idea that we need to impose tariffs in order to bring back all the manufacturing jobs that we've lost over the last 80 years. And I think this is misguided for relatively fundamental reasons. The primary one is that the United States has simply evolved away from being a small manufacturing emerging market style economy into a much more advanced, developed services and tech economy for the most part. And so what's happened is since 1940 to today, for instance, the percentage of total manufacturing employment has fallen from 40% of total employment down to just 7%. And that's largely a function of just automation and the way that the economy has evolved away from being a manufacturing-based economy. And so you're not going to reverse this big trend because it's a very fundamental aspect of what the US economy is evolving into. But the other narrative that is bad about this is that this idea that free trade somehow was the cause of all of this, that these big free trade deals in the 90s, for instance, caused all this to happen. And this is just not consistent with the data. So for instance, from 1940 to 1990, that employment level fell from 40% down to 16%. So the vast majority of this decline in manufacturing employment occurred way before these huge deals like the WTO and NAFTA and these huge trade deals. So Free trade wasn't necessarily the cause of this. This was more a functional, just a reality of the way that the global economy has evolved, and more importantly, the way the US economy has evolved away from being a manufacturing economy more into being a services and tech economy. And so the likelihood of these jobs coming back is just extraordinarily low at this point, especially the way that manufacturing is increasingly turning into being robotics, basically. I mean, that 7% figure today, it's very likely that that number is going to go to 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1% over the course of the next 50 years, simply because robots are going to be doing all the manufacturing in the future. So a related narrative to this is that foreign economies are taking advantage of us and imposing tariffs to hurt us. And the irony in all of this is that by imposing tariffs, they actually hurt themselves more than they hurt us. And the data bears this out. In fact, over the course of the last 50 years, the US economy has grown into by far the wealthiest economy in human history. And although there's been a lot of inequality, which is an issue I should probably touch on in a different video because tariffs are not going to fix inequality and will very likely make it worse, the median American is actually in the top global 10%. So even though there's inequality within the United States, the inequality between the United States and the rest of the world is vastly larger. And that's because we've raced ahead, in large part because we've embraced free trade. And again, you've got to look at the data with this. The median inflation adjusted income has grown by 50% over the course of the last 50 years. And so not only have incomes surged at the median level, but so has median wealth. And so I think that when we talk about this issue, you've got to bear in mind that the free trade era, if anything, was constructed by Americans for Americans to benefit Americans. And the data abundantly shows that with 50% of all global wealth having accumulated to the United States, when you back out countries like the UK, France, China, Germany, and India, we just dominate global financial market wealth. We dominate total wealth. We dominate income growth. We dominate GDP growth. So another common question with this is, if tariffs are so bad, then why do other countries do it to us so often? And the reality is, other countries make lots of bad economic decisions, and that doesn't mean we should follow their lead. So let's use a really simple example with this. I said earlier that foreign countries are making themselves worse off when they impose tariffs. And so if Korea, for instance, imposes a tariff on United States cars coming into the country, what they're really doing is they're making the American product less competitive in the Korean market. And what this does is it reduces competition. Yes, it makes the Korean car makers better off, but what happens is the Korean car manufacturer has greater pricing power because they have less competition. That means that prices are likely to go up because consumers have fewer choices. And this makes everybody worse off. It means that the Korean consumers have to spend more of their income on those cars rather than being able to buy cheaper cars potentially and buy other goods and services. And so by reducing the amount of competition, by essentially manipulating the prices, what the government has done is actually they've made everybody worse off. And so Milton Friedman once said that tariffs are an invisible tax and that you can't see the counterfactual. So the Koreans might think they're better off because they see that the Korean car companies are doing better. But what they don't realize is that by not allowing those competitive forces into the market and potentially reduce prices by giving consumers more choices, they've made everybody worse off. They've reduced domestic income. They've reduced domestic employment. They've raised prices. And in aggregate, they just all end up being worse off. All right, so a common response to this is, if tariffs are implemented by foreign countries, then we have to do it to level the playing field. And this is doubly bad thinking because all this does is make everybody worse off. There is the off chance, I guess, that you can use it as a negotiating tactic, but so far this doesn't seem to be working out so great. And so what we have to understand, though, is that when we respond with our reciprocal tariffs, we're simply making our consumers worse off. We're making our firms worse off by implementing the same anti-competitive forces that the Koreans were, for instance. And so ultimately, with the reciprocal tariff, everybody gets dragged down further. It's similar to Milton Friedman's example was, if you're sitting in a boat with two other guys and one guy decides to shoot holes in the bottom of the boat, well, do you respond by shooting more holes in the bottom of the boat? No. you're exacerbating the problem. You're actually making everybody worse off in the long run. And so tariffs do the exact same thing. They make our domestic market less competitive. That puts upward price pressure on everything in the long run and ultimately makes everybody worse off. It makes the entire global economy less competitive. There's going to be less trade. There's going to be less income. There's probably going to be higher prices. And that makes everything worse off in aggregate. But won't Americans buy more American goods? Isn't that a good thing that we're buying from our domestic producers? No, it's not necessarily, because let's use a simple example here. Let's just say that Yuengling, for instance, has only one beer competitor in the Pennsylvania beer market, and that happens to be Heineken. And they make all their beer in the Netherlands, and they import it in. Well, if we slap a tariff on the Netherlands for 20%, what ends up happening is that Heineken now has to slap a 20% fee on all of their domestic beer production to maintain their margins and try to earn a profit. And so what this does is it reduces domestic competition with Yuengling. And so now Yuengling has more pricing power. Yuengling can operate more like a monopolistic price manipulator. And so that gives them dominance over their consumers in a way that gives us fewer choices. And what this means is that in all likelihood, Yuengling will end up raising prices as they take advantage of this excess market share that is available to them now. And so that gives all the American beer drinkers in Pennsylvania fewer options. It not only increases our prices in the long run, but it gives us less choices. And that means that we're taking more of our income and sending it to Yuengling, which makes all of us worse off in the aggregate because now we're unable to buy as many other goods and services in the long run. So although you've made Yuengling better off, you've made every other consumer and corporation in the economy potentially worse off because they now all have less income, which means fewer jobs, less domestic income for us, and potentially higher prices in the long run. But we did tariffs in the 1800s and the economy boomed and the government generated a huge amount of income. Isn't that a good thing? Not necessarily. First of all, this is a false comparison really. Back then, the US economy was an emerging market manufacturing economy, but this doesn't justify the implementation of the tariffs. And in fact, it looks like the tariffs made everything much more volatile back then. When you look at the actual data from 1800 to 1930, that period was enormously volatile. We had 30 legitimate recessions. We had 6 Great Depressions. We had multiple financial panics. We had a civil war that nearly destroyed the whole country. We had a world war. And then, of course, we had the Great Depression, which was exacerbated by the big tariff act that was implemented in 1930. But more importantly, I think that when you make this comparison, it misunderstands that, yes, it generated larger tax revenue, but that's more of a function of the fact that the US government was just very small back in the 1800s. And so as a total percentage of income, it looks very big, mainly because the US government was just very small. So I think when people make this comparison, they're making a false comparison to two very different type of economies, but they're also massively overstating how great this era was in the first place. But isn't the US economy in decline? Haven't we seen a hollowing out of the middle class and stagnant wages for 50 years? Well, this is a complex issue because living standards are subjective, but from a purely economic perspective, a lot of this data is just simply misrepresented. Personal incomes are up 50% in real median terms over the last 50 years. And the middle class has been shrunk, but in large part because the upper class has expanded. And that's reflected in that fact that the median American is in the top 10% of all global wealth. So we are, by any historical measure, the wealthiest economy that has ever existed. And so I'm not trying to downplay the fact that there are very real problems that need to be fixed. But again, tariffs are an especially bad way to go after these problems because they're a regressive tax that hurt the poor the most. If we want to fight inequality, we need to attack it in other, more sensible ways. And a regressive tax on the poorest middle-class consumers in this country is one of the very worst ways to go about doing that. All right, but isn't this persistent balance of trade problem a risk to the US economy in the long run as we're constantly a debtor to the rest of the world where we're sending out dollars every year? This is a complex issue, but in the case of the United States, which is an enormously productive economy, the emphatic answer is no. And let's slap some numbers on this, because when we look at this in the aggregate and you think of this as a single person, the example becomes pretty obvious. So we run about a $1 trillion trade deficit with the rest of the world. You can think of that as that's dollars that are going out of the country. But domestically, we do $30 trillion of domestic income every single year. And more importantly, our net worth, the amount of our assets minus our liabilities, is gigantic. It's $160 trillion just at the private sector level. And so that's reflected by $250 trillion of total assets. So if you think of this as one person, you could think of it as a man that, let's say it's me, and I spend $1,000 a year. That goes out to, say, my Mexican barber, which I obviously don't have a Mexican barber because nobody would cut hair this badly. But you have $1,000 that goes out, but then I have $30,000 of domestic income, and then I have $250,000 of domestic assets that I own, and $160,000 of total net worth. How much would that $1,000 that you send out every year really bother you when you know that your domestic income is so much greater, and more importantly, the assets that you produce, the real goods and services that you own, are vastly, vastly more important to your balance sheet and income statement in the aggregate? When you think of it in those terms, this concept it makes no sense. And it's not to say that this couldn't potentially become a big problem, but at present, it's very clear that anybody looking at the balance sheet and income statement here and getting excessively worried over the net outflow of $1,000 when they have $30,000 of domestic income, and then more importantly, the vast quantities of domestic assets, in terms of the importance of that $1,000, it just is virtually irrelevant in the long run. All right, that's all I got. I know this is a hugely politically charged issue. I'm sorry that this is going to infuriate a lot of people, but I hope that from an economic perspective, I sincerely hope this country can come to terms with the fact that this is a very, very bad way to implement this. There are vastly better options. I know we have huge problems, and I have lots of ideas for solutions to actually solving these problems in rational ways. This is simply not it. All the economists agree. History bears this out. The basic economic facts bear this out. And I hope this video has helped sort of clarify a lot of that for you.